Realism is a theory that basically says that what states are principally concerned about is the balance of power. And great powers care greatly about how powerful they are relative to other great powers because they worry about their survival. If you're weak in the international system, other great powers or great powers in general will take advantage of you. Just consider the Chinese. They have this period from the late 1840s to the late 1940s that they refer to as the century of national humiliation. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, why were the Chinese humiliated? They were humiliated for one very simple reason. They were weak, and therefore the European great powers, the United States and Japan, took advantage of them. Another example that highlights this: the Russians, after the Soviet Union fell apart, were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion. They made it very clear from the beginning that NATO expansion was a threat to Russia. Nevertheless, the United States pushed forward NATO expansion in 1999. That was the first tranche. 2004, that was the second tranche. And then in 2008, NATO said that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. What was going on here? What was going on was that Russia was very weak. And because Russia was weak and the United States was very powerful, the United States felt it could shove NATO expansion down the Russians' throat. That's what happens to you when you're weak in international politics. So what you want to do is be very powerful. You want to be more powerful than all your rivals, simply because that is the best way to survive. So that's the first point I'd make about realism. The second point is that realism does not discriminate between democracies and non-democracies, or liberal states and fascist states or communist states. Realism treats all states as black boxes. All states want to maximize their relative power, regardless of the political order on the home front. That argument is one that drives most people in the West crazy. They don't like that argument because they think that the democracies are the good guys and the authoritarian states or the communist states or whatever are the bad guys. Whereas realism says there are no good guys and bad guys. They're just states competing for power because they care about their survival. So I think in a nutshell, that's a pretty good description of what realism is all about. It's important to discriminate between situations where the United States is really pushing for democracy and not behaving according to balance of power politics, versus situations where the United States is acting in a very realist fashion, but disguising its behavior with liberal rhetoric. During the unipolar moment, which runs from roughly 1990, maybe 1991, up until about 2017, the United States, in my opinion, did not act in a realist fashion. It acted in a liberal fashion, and it pursued a foreign policy that I would describe as liberal hegemony. Now, why did the United States pursue this liberal policy during the unipolar moment? It's because the United States was the only great power on the planet. It was the sole pole. Therefore, great power politics did not matter to the United States because there were no other great powers in the system. So the United States, in a very important way, was free to pursue a liberal foreign policy. And just take China, for example. We pursued a policy of engagement towards China. Our basic view was that we should help China get rich. We should integrate China into international institutions like the WTO, and then it would become a responsible stakeholder. And as it became a responsible stakeholder and it got richer and richer, it would become a liberal democracy, just like the Asian tigers did a few decades before. And once China was a liberal democracy, it would live happily ever after with its neighbors and with the United States, because the system would be comprised of good guys, because liberal democracies are good guys in the liberal view. So what I'm saying to you is that during the unipolar moment, realism was taken out of the equation for the United States, and we pursued a liberal policy. And remember, people like me, who is always thinking in terms of realism, Someone like me, I argued that this was crazy to help China grow more powerful, because as China grew more powerful, it would cause the United States all sorts of problems. It would try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. So anyway, what you have during the unipolar moment is the United States acting in a very liberal fashion. Then, starting in about 2017, 2018, the United States understands that they have a problem.
Yeah.
And they adopt a containment policy, if not a rollback policy against China. The United States, this happens under Trump, becomes very realist. Then Trump is defeated, Joe Biden comes to power, and Joe Biden, who had been a big supporter of engagement, now pursues realpolitik behavior towards China. But he disguises that realpolitik behavior with liberal rhetoric. So if you listen to Biden and his lieutenants talk, they talk the liberal game.
Right.
But underneath that liberal velvet glove is the mailed fist, as the Chinese well understand. But that was not the case during the unipolar moment. And there, the United States was pursuing, in my opinion, a thoroughly liberal policy. China just grew so powerful that the United States began to fear it, as I predicted it would.
Yeah.
I mean, many people would say that the Chinese acted in very aggressive ways, that it's the Chinese fault for sort of violating Deng Xiaoping's basic axiom that you should lie low and, don't provoke. I don't think that the Chinese were especially provocative.
Yeah.
I think what happened is that the Americans began to understand that China was growing bigger and bigger, and they were spending more money on defense.
Right.
And as soon as that begins to happen, the Americans think that the Chinese are a real threat and that threat has to be contained. And of course, what that does is, as the United States becomes more aggressive towards China, China becomes more aggressive towards the United States, which becomes more aggressive toward China, and on and on.
Right.
And that's what you see happening now. You have this ratcheting up of the security competition. You're sort of going up the escalation ladder. And in my opinion, that was inevitable once China's economic growth began to appear to be very impressive to the United States. Well, if you talk about an order, you're talking about the institutions that are so important for economic and political intercourse among states. And during the unipolar moment, the United States was in charge of the order. And that's a way of saying the United States wrote the rules and enforced the rules, and everybody else obeyed the rules. So you had a liberal international order. It was run basically by the United States. And by the way, that was originally the Western order from the Cold War. During the Cold War, you had two orders. You had a Soviet-led order and an American-led order. And the United States won the Cold War. The Soviet Union disappeared. And what the United States did is it took that Western order and it transformed it into a liberal international order, which it could do because it was the unipole. But once you move into a multipolar world where you have two other great powers, China and Russia, and China is a peer competitor to the United States. Russia's not. Russia's the weakest of those three great powers. Right. Nevertheless, the Chinese, as they grow more and more powerful, are going to be unhappy with an order in which the rules were written by the United States. And the Chinese are going to want to write their own rules for that order, or they're going to want to change the rules in a way that's more favorable to the Chinese. So what we have going on here now is that as the Chinese and the Americans clash at a geostrategic level, you see the Chinese working to create their own order.
Right.
Their own order, the AIIB, Belt and Road, and on and on. And the Americans, of course, are beginning to create their own order, AUKUS, the Quad, and so forth and so on. So if you think about it, what's happening here is you're reverting back to a situation that looks a lot like the Cold War, where you have a Chinese-led order and an American-led order, just like you had a Soviet-led order and an American-led order during the Cold War. And then on top of these two orders, you have a weak international order.
Yeah.
And this includes institutions like the United Nations, the non-proliferation regime. These are institutions where both the United States and China are deeply involved. And of course, the Russians are as well. So we've left the liberal international order in the dust. There's no liberal international order anymore. What we have are two emerging regional orders, right? And on top of that, an increasingly thin international order.